Good evening. I'm Karen Taylor. I'm Program Director of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, and I'm delighted to welcome you all here this evening. This is our final Labour lecture, and this is part of the Labour, Literature and Landmark Lecture Series. The Labour, Literature and Landmark Lectures are supported in part by public funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs in partnership with the City Council. For those of you who this may be your first visit, the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York is a nonprofit organization that was founded in 1785. You will find information on the Society and its various diverse programs on a blue postcard on your seat. This lecture tonight is part of a distinguished lecture series that dates back to 1837. The space you're in this evening is, of course, our library, the General Society Library. It was founded in 1820 and is the second oldest library in New York City and one of the city's 3 remaining membership libraries. And for those of you who might be interested in membership, on the registration table at the back, you will find some information on that. I also want to mention that after tonight's lecture, there'll be a short wine and cheese reception that we hope you will stay for. And every attendee this evening will be entered in a raffle to win a copy of this magnificent monograph, The Designs of Abe Jacob. So we're delighted about that, and we want to thank Abe very much for donating those. As I mentioned, this is the final of 4 Labour lectures that have provided a behind-the-scenes look at the creative arts in New York City. And we've had the pleasure of being able to collaborate with USA 829 with this series. And the series, of course, has been curated by the president of local USA 829, Bev Miller. And representing USA 829 this evening, and introducing our speaker, Abe Jacob, I feel like you may have met him before, is Nevin Steinberg, head of USA 829 Sound Designers Committee. Nevin is a seasoned Broadway sound designer associated with multiple productions. In 2013, he opened the acclaimed Rodgers and Hammerstein Cinderella on Broadway and received a Tony Award nomination for that, for his work on the production. Other recent projects include Hamilton at the Public Theatre, It Should Have Been You, and Terence McNally's Mothers and Sons on Broadway. Steve Martin and Eddie Brinkle's Bright Star at the Old Globe, and the world premiere of John Kander and Greg Pierce's musical The Landing at the Vineyard Theatre, which continues his dedication to the creation of new work. He is also the audio consultant for the Stern Auditorium at the Carnegie Hall, and he's been very kind to spare some time for us this evening, and I'm really pleased to introduce to you Nevin Steinberg.
Well, I'm so glad you covered all that, Karen, because I was going to do it, but you saved me some time, so now. Well, thank you for having me, and I'm honored to be here. None of you know this, but I've known Abe since I was 6 years old. Sort of. I grew up in Westchester County, not far from here, and my parents were theater goers. And in 1972, my folks returned from a trip to the city and a performance of Jesus Christ Superstar on Broadway, and they came home raving about the show. But the thing that stuck with me from their recounting their trip was a detailed description of a specific moment of stagecraft that they experienced that night. And I want you to remember, we're talking about lay people here. We're talking about people who were not professional theater people. They enjoyed the theater, but they had no life in the theater, unlike myself or Abe. My dad was a secondary school principal, and my mom was a former teacher and a stay-at-home mother. But the one thing and I still can't believe this is true, a true story. The one thing that they couldn't stop talking about was a number in the show in which the principal characters were surrounded by a writhing ensemble of dancers who, using highly choreographed and stylized gestures, delivered handheld wired microphones to the singers, each one receiving the mic just before their solo. And adding to this bit of theater magic, the microphone cables were dressed to resemble the vegetation and vines that were part of the scenic design. This vivid memory, the impression it made on my parents, and subsequently on me, is how I first encountered the distinguished gentleman I have the honor of introducing to you today. Superstar was just one of the many shows that benefited from Abe's innovations in the theater, but I think it illustrates how a great mind brings expertise and experience to bear on a changing art form at just the right moment. Not simply a technical solution applied to a pesky problem, but an utterly thorough approach to a moment of storytelling. One that no doubt required discourse at the highest levels of artistic collaboration between the director, the choreographer, the composer, the actors, the scenic and prop designers, and who knows how many others. And this was just one example of the countless decisions, large and small, that the sound designer makes in an effort to create a unique experience for the audience and a satisfying expression of the work for himself and his collaborators, and of course for my parents who were there that night. This kind of work requires curiosity and candor, humility and hubris, empathy and ethics, all of which Abe has shared with literally 4 decades of protégés, all of whom owe our careers to him in some way. Those of us who work in the field are often hard-pressed to explain what we do in anything other than the most simple terms. And I heard it said just this morning, actually, and I quote, it is massively complex, and most of it is invisible. It is a real challenge to figure out how do we communicate things that require years and years of technical understanding and compress that into seconds of speech. That quote, for those of you who've been following the news, was from Edward Snowden. And he was talking about the internet, but one sympathizes. And we are fortunate today that since there is nobody better qualified to guide you through the complexities and subtleties of the craft than the godfather of theatrical sound design himself and my friend, Abe Jacob.
Well, that's all I have to say, so thank you very much for coming. Yes. Thank you very much for that, Nevin. I'm very pleased and honored to be able to address this distinguished group tonight in these hallowed halls. But in looking out at this audience, I'm thinking of my topic, I feel with some trepidation, a bit like Elizabeth Taylor's 7th husband must have felt on their wedding night. How do I make this interesting? So let me try to make this interesting, or at least entertaining. Sound design is the process of specifying, acquiring, manipulating, or generating audio elements to tell a story by nonverbal means. In reality, it's the truthful reproduction of the sound source in every listening area of the venue. Modern scientific research describes the world and cosmos in terms of rhythm and sound. Sound consists of vibrations or oscillations in particles, and these vibrations are found throughout the universe. These insights, stemming from discoveries in physics, suggest that the Earth and the universe not only produce vibrations, but in fact are vibrations. Sound causes changes on the physical, the emotional, mental, and spiritual planes. What we hear is a vibration, the movement of molecules in air that reach our ears and in turn vibrate our eardrum and send transmissions to the brain, which then translates that vibration into perception of sound. It is up to the individual brain to provide this translation, which is the reason each of us perceives the same vibration as being different. It's why no 2 people at the same event at the same time will ever be able to say they heard the same thing. Look at the Greek amphitheater at Epidaurus, around since the 5th century BC, and how it was designed to amplify the human voice by the shape of the seating area, with its hollowed-out benches, decorative bronze vases, which resonated at certain frequencies, and along with traditional masks the actors wore, all served to project the voice. The masks were also used for costume changes. Now, let's skip over the next 2,000 years of theater history. Not too much happened technically. In Shakespeare's time and throughout much of theater history, the only indications of sound were creation of sound or mood effects, thunder and lightning, background noises, and other special effects. These were the so-called noises off. But even I'm not old enough to remember those days, or even the first instance of electronic amplification on Broadway. By the way, it occurred for the show Earl Carroll's Vanities in 1933 at what is now the Helen Hayes Theater. The producer brought his sound engineer and equipment from a Hollywood film studio, which you can see on the screen, to create a sound design for this review. All sound systems for theater at that time were derived from motion picture projection equipment as originally developed by Bell Telephone Laboratories. Well, how did I get started? As a child actor in my hometown of Tucson, Arizona, my first solo role was in the play The Princes and Mrs. Parker at the age of 8. Then a walk-on in a Ronald Reagan movie western and the role of Tad Lincoln in Abe Lincoln in Illinois at the University of Arizona. I retired from the stage at the age of 10. So I thought of becoming a musician, studied piano for 3 years, never wanted to practice, and soon realized I would never be very good. But music and theater were still encouraging, so I did everything I could in school to do everything I could in those fields without ever having to be on stage. While in high school, I worked for a sound company in San Francisco and continued on with them part-time through college. August of 1966, having just graduated, came back to San Francisco and was put to work on the sound crew for an outdoor concert. Well, little did we know then that this would be the famous concert, The Beatles at Candlestick Park, their final live performance. It's interesting to note that this possibly proves Mark Twain's adage that the coldest winter he ever spent was one summer in San Francisco. This was in August, and you can see the people wearing their heavy coats around the field. It was, in fact, actually true. The sound equipment for this Beatles concert was probably only maybe twice as large as the amount of equipment that's in this room right now. We had very little equipment. The reason the Beatles never continued to perform was that nobody ever heard them, above the screaming of the girls and the imperfect sound systems. From then on until 1971, I was on the road doing concert sound, first for the Mamas and the Papas, who did very few live performances, but brilliant ones when they were on their game. And they were also very proud of the fact that I gave them the same microphones we used for the Beatles at Candlestick Park. Cass always wanted to have John Lennon's microphone with her. While touring with the Mamas and Papas, I was asked to do sound for the Monterey Pop Festival in June of 1967. It was there that I first met Jimi Hendrix, and this was his first performance in the United States as the Jimi Hendrix Experience. After Monterey, Jimi went on tour with the Dick Clark Caravan of Stars as the opening act for the Monkees. And needless to say, this didn't last very long as the Mothers of America rose up in protest that this was not the right opening act for their children to see with the Monkees. He decided to go out on his own, and his management remembered me from Monterey, and soon I was out touring with him since the Mamas and Papas were no longer working. I continued with him until his unfortunate death in September of 1970. Here we are at an outdoor concert in Stockholm. I had more hair in those days, but as you can see, the fans, the young ladies, haven't changed much. We mixed the show from backstage because, like I say, it was outdoors in a park, and they didn't want us in the front of house. While with Jimi, I met Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, who were looking for a new sound engineer. So in between Hendrix dates, I went around the world with the trio from 1968 until they took their first retirement in 1971. It was a simple sound system, 2 vocal mics, a guitar mic, a stand-up bass, and 6 loudspeakers. For all of the tours that I was on, all of our gear fit into either a 19-foot rental truck or 2 station wagons or traveled as excess baggage. Today, concert tours use anywhere from 6 to 40 trucks to move their show. This led to the Jacob corollary: the talent of the act is inversely proportional to the number of vehicles needed to move the act. In the off time, I went back to San Francisco and continued to put together sound systems for Bay Area theaters and my introduction to theater sound design. I attempted to use some of the same methods we used for concerts and expanded on those developments for theater. I quickly learned that every show has unique challenges and problem solving can be fun, except when it's not. And through Peter, I met Michael Butler, who was producing a new musical called Hair. He thought the show's sound could be better and asked me to come to New York City, listen, and see what could be done. I did go, redesign the sound system, and then went on to design 10 productions of Hair throughout the world. And it was the start of my Broadway career. This is a shot of yes, that's the original bandstand for Hair. A little ratty, but all the instruments were there, and the musicians played on the side of the stage. It was an interesting time. And in 1972, while visiting New York City, I stopped in to visit friends at a preview of Jesus Christ Superstar. The first 2 previews were canceled because of technical sound problems. When the director, Tom O'Horgan, saw me, he asked if I could help. I said yes, and I've been here in New York ever since. Of course, I was hesitant about leaving my full-time job in San Francisco, but when Mike Jeffries, Jen Hendricks' former manager, called and asked if I would be interested in managing Electric Lady Studios here in New York, I knew I now had the security of a real job again, in case this theater thing didn't work out. Nevin mentioned the microphone cords disguised to look like vines. It's true, the basic problem with Jesus Christ Superstar and the reason for their technical delays were that they were trying to use radio microphones in 1972, and they just, one, weren't good, weren't reliable, and were picking up any number of taxi cab drivers and other CB radio interferences. So the first thing I said was, let's give them handheld mics like we used in Hair. And Tom O'Horgan agreed to that. I forget who the choreographer was. Anyway, said we could work with that. And Robin Wagner carefully said, I'll make them look like vines, grapevines. And that's how we ended up doing the show with wired hand mics and gave them their third preview that had been canceled. I also soon discovered that I was the only one being credited with the sound design by title, so I knew that I would have very little competition in this field and would soon be able to create a whole new theater discipline. Pippin with Bob Fosse was my first sound design from scratch in New York, and from then on I was fortunate to design the rest of his original productions, Chicago, Dancin', and Big Deal. During the out-of-town tryout of Chicago, I received a call from Michael Bennett, whom I had met in 1974 while doing the road company of Seesaw. He said they were doing a little workshop at the Public Theater and could I come and do sound. So in April of 1975, I was shuffling between Philadelphia and New York City, between Michael Bennett and Bob Fosse, between Chicago and a chorus line, the 2 big hits of '75. Oh, and by the way, in 10 days, it will be the 40th anniversary of the opening of a chorus line at the Public Theater. Dealing with these 2 brilliant men of the theater was not an easy choice, but they were the most interesting times of my theatrical career. So I continued working with Bobby, and my associate and production sound engineer, Otz Munderloh, went on to design Michael's other productions. And all through from the 70s through the early 80s, there were any number of productions that I was involved with. Again, a lot of things had to do with the Beatle music. This was Sgt. Pepper that we did at the Beacon Theater. John Lennon came to see it and had that photo taken. Later on, Beatlemania was the other production that we did with Beatle music, and I played at the Winter Garden Theater and ran for a number of years. And finally, another production that I'm particularly proud of was the production of Evita in London with Elaine Page and Joss Ackland. Those were actually the microphones used in that time. The 2 larger microphones that looked like bird cages had contemporary microphones in them so that we could pick up her sound. And finally, the last production just done in 2010 was Rain, the tribute to the Beatles on Broadway. And it was sort of the culmination of all of the technological advances that we have made over the past 30 years. It's hard to pick a favorite, but my feeling is that the show you're doing at the time is your favorite. But looking back over the past, certainly a chorus line stands out. It was done without wireless microphones. Everything was area miking, with choreography coordinated to put people in a place where they could be heard. It was a concept musical that certainly embodied what the life of theater was all about. Certainly that was a special time. But we had a special problem on a chorus line, the noise of the Schubert Theater's HVAC system, especially in the summer after the move from the public theater. During the very quiet Paul monologue, the Paul talk it was called, it was very hard to hear what he was saying over the noise of the fans and air conditioning. And Michael suggested that maybe we put a body mic on him. I thought this would be a change in the dynamic of the show and thought it was not a great idea. So realizing that it was the noise of the fans, we then came up with the thought that during the Cassie dance, the music just before, with the loud audience applause, we would give a cue to the building engineer to turn off the fans. They did. It became quiet in that space of a minute or so while the fans died down. The Paul monologue went on with just the area miking that we had, and it was heard. And during the tap number, which followed it, the loud music, they turned the fans back on, and you heard the show. Now, of course, this was also July in New York, so it was a little warm, and the audience also felt a little bit of the uncomfort that Paul felt while he was giving the monologue, telling about his life and his early stories. But that's another example of sound design that has nothing to do with the technology. It's merely solving a problem by fixing it rather than trying to avoid it. Sound-wise, the musical Beatlemania was a challenge, if only because George Martin and Paul McCartney saw it at various times. Even though they may have expressed reservations about the content of the show, they did say it sounded remarkably like their recordings, and to me that certainly was high praise. Creating the Sgt. Pepper concept album live on stage was an immense challenge at the time, and I think we did it quite well, though it certainly would be easier with today's technology. But in 2010, we recreated the Beatlemania sound with the tribute show Rain, and it was certainly a lot easier the second time around. Before there were radio, movies, television, records, home hi-fis, compact discs, or internet downloads, people went to a place of performance, the auditorium, to hear and experience the magic of live theater. And then in the mid-1940s, theater buffs were delighted to find they were able to purchase for about $2.50 a new kind of entertainment, one that could be experienced in the home. I'm referring to the original cast LP. This disc, played on a $40 record player, allowed the theatergoer's family to sit in their living rooms and recreate the magic of live theater, experienced a few evenings or weeks before. Today, with expanding mobile platforms and high-speed streaming, you can download songs from a yet unproduced musical or concept album, listen to it on personal earbuds, and then at some future date, go to a theater and have all of us recreate the magic you experienced in your head. This certainly has changed in recent years, and much of the change is because the basis for what audience retain as reference is no longer their imagination, but rather what they've heard, sampled, and stored, then reproduced by other artificial means, whether it be on CDs, DVDs, or downloads. All that has contributed to the fact that increasingly our perception of what something sounds like is no longer from our own experience, but from someone else's. Whether that's good or bad, I don't know, but it is what it is. So when you go to the theater, or to the cinema, or to the opera house, what audiences expect is a sound that they have heard previously via mechanical reproduction, rather than sound heard previously live. In the old days, somebody would shake a sheet of metal to make thunder sound, and our imagination would fill in the rest. Now audiences expect more, something like the real thing, or at least the motion picture epic's version of what a thunderclap should sound like. That's what we're spoiled by again. If you're outside in a thunderstorm, it sounds very different than it does in a movie theater. That's the most obvious example. The reality of the situation is that it's mechanical reproduction that has become the reference standard and not actual recall or imagination. Now, the challenge to reproduce the sound with sufficient quality so that it doesn't immediately strike the audience as being electronic or distorted in origin is our hardest task. We do have the technology in digital and the analog world to make that possible. I believe our job is to reproduce the sound with the same quality and level that it has at the source. If you can do that, you're correct as far as reinforcement. Anything other than that becomes a special effect. So the thundering voice of Eva Peron in Evita when she was on the balcony certainly wasn't natural, but it was the reality of the situation and the actual inauguration spectacle before thousands of people. A quiet duet on stage needs to be just that, but you have to have the same effect in the last row as in the first. So therefore, the extent of the sound system may be greater, but the level needs to be tempered with reality. Since part of the subject of these lectures is labor, I would like to give you a little bit of the background of how we became part of the union. Back in 1984, the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees, the IATSE, came to fellow sound designer Jack Shearing and me to establish representation for sound designers working on Broadway and nationally. Sound Designers Association Local 922 was chartered that year. The struggle then was to establish a collective bargaining agreement with various producers, and it took us a couple of years even to begin negotiations with trade organizations, the League of American Theaters. We eventually established a simple collective bargaining agreement that covered minimum fees, additional weekly compensation, and certain benefit plans. It wasn't the greatest agreement, but it was better than nothing, and it gave us the validity of being represented by a collective bargaining unit. We were never strong enough to implement additional terms on that agreement. In 1992, Local 1 here in New York approached me about merging with Local 922 so that Local 1 would have jurisdiction over sound designers on Broadway with the additional clout that they would bring. This changed our charter a bit because it meant that Local 922, with its national reach, would have to cede jurisdiction of sound designers in regional theaters, since Local 1 would only have representation on Broadway. This is when United Scenic Artists, Local 829, started to represent designers working regionally, while Local 1 maintained the representation on Broadway. Local 1 attempted to improve the terms of our agreement with the League, but we had just one renewal with terms only slightly better than the original late 1980s contract. We encouraged Local 1 to come to better terms with the League, but that never seemed to be in the forefront of the League's agenda. So sound designers still weren't properly represented, and Local 1 officers eventually agreed and made overtures to cede jurisdiction to USA Local 829. A cooperative venture, really, starting back in April of 2010. IATSE's International Executive Board approved the transfer of representation effective July 2011. And in 2012, because of the bargaining power USA 829 has with the League, we now have a collective bargaining agreement that for the first time puts sound designers everywhere on a parity with our colleagues in the other design fields. And I must mention a bit about the controversy over the elimination of the Tony Award for Best Achievement in Sound Design, which was first established in 2007. Steps are being taken to correct the situation and reestablish a meaningful award for outstanding achievement in all creative fields. Even though nearly 40,000 signatures from all over the world were sent to the Tony Administration Committee protesting this decision, we will not see it corrected this Broadway season, however. So now what does the sound designer do that we are now represented? First thing is prepare a shop order. This was the shop order from Pippin. It was one typewritten page. And a lot of the stuff on it was returned because we didn't need all of that. For Rain, I'm going to show you 2 pages of an 11-page shop order, which lists the loudspeakers, consoles, computers, and all the other necessary items that go into producing a show. You do a drawing to tell your operators and people that put the show together how everything is connected. This was the original hand drawing for a chorus line. Very simple, very, very straightforward. a few years later, when we did the national tour of A Chorus Line, it ended up looking a little bit like that, and that was again, still one page of a two-page drawing. For the Evita tours, we expanded to 3 or 4 pages, and these are some of the drawings that were done for that show. Today, the sound equipment takes up significant amounts of space in the theater. This is one of the photos of what the amplifier looked like backstage to power all the loudspeaker systems in the theater. This is the radio mic rack. With the radio receivers, there could be anywhere up to 40 wireless microphones in use on a Broadway show these days. And this is Soundland, where everything is put together, where the backstage operator works, and all the equipment is there for that particular show. Now, all of this equipment is put together in a shop, and is specific to each production. A Broadway theater only has 4 walls and the main curtain and the seats. Everything else that is involved with the production is brought in by the show. What the sound designer doesn't do. Well, one, we're not responsible for the downfall of the American musical. We're not the sole person responsible for a bad-sounding show. Many other people contribute to those decisions. We cannot control the laws of physics. A bad loudspeaker position dictated by scenic or lighting design choices will always be a bad loudspeaker position. And we cannot anticipate other people's decisions, a change in a line reading, a substitute musician, weather conditions, etc. How are we to anticipate? Now, for the future of sound design. Modern microphones and loudspeaker systems are extremely linear and capable of providing reinforcement with minimal detection. They are small and make far less noise than the lights and staging apparatus. Current DSP technology gives us the ability to track actors on cue and other subtle manipulations that extend the artistic range open to actors. We are ready, willing, and able, and we want nothing more than for nobody to know we are even in the room. Traditionalism dies hard in any field, but in the world of the stage, it's always the sound department that's forced to wear the prairie dress. Does anybody tell the lighting folks they need to burn lime or forbid the stagehands the use of electrical winches? Is polyester forbidden in costumes? And yet the sound department is obliged to play by the rules of the 50s, 1550 to 1950, even on a closet drama set in the 1980s. It was easy to detect the presence of sound systems in the olden days, my days. The amplified sound contained a variety of clues that betrayed us. Loudspeakers were not good enough. Mic placement options were poor. We only had primitive capabilities for signal processing. It's time to update the files because none of these things, as articles and letters from the New York Times point out, are true anymore. This is from the New York Times. And it was in 1981. Letters to the editors in those days, and if you want to read some of them. I just wonder if these old-fashioned blogs have any more validity because they were printed in the New York Times rather than as they do in the chat rooms of today. Taste. Producers and directors should get some. I thought I was kind of like that ending. And this one, especially, he refuses to pay up to $25 for a ticket. When we installed an architectural electronic enhancement system in the then New York State Theater for New York City Opera, even that was called to task. So for the second time in my career, the New York Times deemed me responsible for destroying 2 major performing arts disciplines. This is an accomplishment not many others can claim. And then when I made page 6 in the New York Post, my legend was now secured. I had to leave the production of Cats here in New York over creative differences with the producer and the composer. It's easy to forget that theater is an inherently amplified event. The makeup artists greatly amplify the facial features. Stage scenery and props are overly contrasted with exaggerated features. A single floor lamp in an apartment lights up the entire room, evenly. Up close, however, the actors look like clowns, the stage looks like a cartoon, and the lights can be blinding. But out in the house, these amplifications serve the purpose of making a distant visual event appear much closer, and it all feels natural to us. That's the magic of theater. The actors' voices also need to rescale to reach the house at a proper level. They should be amplified. The questions are simply how much and by whom. If all the gain comes from the actor, the price is unnatural diction, inappropriate tonal emotional cues, and stiff posture. If part of the required acoustic gain can come from the sound system, the actors can relax into a more natural speech pattern that matches the emotions of the spoken words. As the sound system carries more of the burden, the actors can reduce the need to constantly broadcast their voices. The downside risk is increasing vulnerability to loudspeaker detection, but modern sound systems can bend this much further than ever, but only if we have the cooperation of other departments. If I move off this microphone and continue talking, you can still hear me, but it is a much more forced and much more unnatural sound than it would be with the aid of the sound system, which is partially what we're talking about in the theater. The four key factors where interdisciplinary coordination pay off in supporting actors' voices are location, 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 and noise. We need multiple positions so we can get loudspeakers that align well with varying audience sightlines to the stage and to coherently interface with the building's architecture. If lighting and stage noise can be minimized, then everyone needs less acoustic gain and our range of stealth operation expands. But even with all the criticism, there are still many rewards for me in this adventure. 50 years after first really becoming involved with sound, I was fortunate to work once again with someone who was there at my initiation. Paul McCartney composed a score for New York City Ballet, and here we are behind the sound console at the Koch Theater in Lincoln Center, where I find myself these days as the house sound engineer for New York City Ballet and the various touring attractions we present. Today's audiences have moved on. The presence of loudspeakers did not offend them. Hint, you put loudspeakers in your ears all day. They expect a show to be up close and personal as watching TV at home, or like the movie the play is based on. But with the added extras of live actors, 3D staging, lighting, and sound without the glasses. It's time now for the rest of the theater world to move on and use all of the tools available to them. But there are still some diehards who believe that all sound systems in the theater are evil. These folks we cannot convince. It's true that a sound reinforcement system is not required for every production. But then again, neither are makeup, costumes, lighting, and staging. The only mandatory attendee is the playwright's story brought to life by the actors. All other disciplines are invited to enhance the conveyance of that experience to the audience. The question of to be or not to be reinforced should be weighed in the context of how well we can actually enhance the actor's transmission rather than the romantic notions of tradition. Saying this to most people who grew up with sound in their daily life is like preaching to the converted. While I am no longer actively designing on Broadway, I am most proud of the second and third generation of sound designers now doing major productions all over the world, who at one time worked with me or for me in those early days. The students I have and continue to mentor are what makes all of this worthwhile. Sound design is actually an equal serving of politics, knowledge, and psychology. Like any business, some days are good days and some are bad. But having a great creative team makes for a great environment in which to work. And much of the job is being able to communicate with other people. Sound cannot exist in a vacuum. We are all in this together. So maybe this will help a little bit towards getting some understanding the next time you hear sound system. I don't need no stinking sound system. And thankfully now I have very little left to say. I do need to thank a number of people for helping put this together. My associates Josh Reed and Daniel Lundberg, Bob McCarthy and Kai Harada provided valuable material, and I thank them for letting me use it. Beverly Miller at USA Local 829, who introduced me to the Society in the first place, and Karen Taylor here at the Society for making this a very pleasant experience. So now I'll be happy to take further questions or comments and try to answer them. So thank you very much. Questions? I've stunned you all.
Can you tell us more of the breakup regarding Cats? That sounds like a great story. Or is that something you can't reveal?
No, it was a friendly breakup with Cats. I was actually doing too much at the same time, and Andrew felt that I wasn't paying enough attention to his show. He had also had another sound designer from England that he had been working with in the recording studio and was there at the same time. And they were making decisions that I felt were sort of detrimental to the sound of the show, at least as far as I was concerned. So the best thing for me to do in that instance was to say thank you and goodbye. Financially, it was a huge mistake. But it satisfied my time and my mind at that particular moment.
I have so many questions. I have to try to part into one ultimate question. Jimi Hendrix's legend goes not just musically, artistically, but also his technical acumen is quite legendary. And that includes particularly the Electric Ladyland studio downtown.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder if you could elaborate on that, saying that you didn't manage it, you said?
I did. I managed it for about 6 months and then eliminated the job that I had because it was made it much more efficient for running, and then got very busy doing theater, so it was right after Pippin. The studio was built by Jimmy, for Jimmy, by John Stork, who designed it. It was an incredible place to record and to perform, and if anybody knows the history of Electric Lady Studios, you can certainly find that out. Mike Jeffries was his manager, asked me to come back and manage it because there was nobody else in the organization doing it. So actually, while I came back to run the studios, Mike unfortunately was killed in an airplane crash over Spain. So it ended up that the studio was in the hands of two estates who were fighting with each other, and it was not a pleasant place to be. So I left to go on and do Broadway, which at the time was much more pleasant.
And it must have been somewhat heartbreaking when they finally dismantled and tore it all down. I think it was
Well,
in
it's
the
still
90s.
there.
Yeah.
It's not the same as it was, but
Right.
but it's still there with some of the rooms. The equipment's all different.
Yes, yeah. Thank you.
Abe, thank you so much. What was two questions? What was it like to work with Paul McCartney, and what collaboration did you become involved with that you felt you learned the most from?
I'll answer the second part of that question first. It was the experiences of working with the great directors of the day, the Michael Bennett's, the Bob Fosse's, Gower Champion, Michael Kidd, Jerry Robbins. They all created a whole world of theater that was their vision, their view, and it made it work for all of the other departments involved, from the composers and authors all the way down through the crew and the performers. Bob Fosse, until right up during Big Deal, the last show he did, he was always afraid that he was never very good at what he did, and that nobody would appreciate his work, and that it wasn't right. So that kind of drive to keep it going was something that he instilled in all of us, I think. Working with Paul McCartney, when we first met, when he came back to do the ballet for New York City Ballet, we were in the room in the meet and greet, and we were introduced again. And I said, well, actually, sir, I have met you. We met 40 some odd years ago at Candlestick Park doing your last concert. And his comment was, well, I guess it's time we work together again then, isn't it? So he had, you know, he doesn't read music. He writes the melody, and so his whole thing was orchestrated by others, but his sense of melody and timing was terrific. What the two of them created as the Beatles will always be their sense of harmony and vocal melody, or their sense of melody and vocal harmony, something that is very unique and quite rare. And I'm glad that I was able to do a number of Beatles shows on Broadway. It's great music to fall back on.
Hi, Abe. I teach a sound class to stage management and lighting design and technical direction students. And I'm wondering what, from those disciplines, in your experience, you wish some of the people you worked with would know about sound or understand about sound, or would be able to do to make your job easier?
Fortunately, all of the experiences I've had in the collaborative field with others have been relatively successful and painless. As I said, we don't exist in a vacuum. It's working with all of us. It might be simpler to have said that, I wish lighting designers would do their own intercom. That's always the bane of existence of sound going into a theater. But we're all there to help each other. Stage management was actually the first sound design on Broadway. They were the ones that took the note and the text from the script and said, we need the bird whistle here, and we need an ambulance siren, or a car backing up, or whatever, and went to a sound shop. They took the records down, made a tape, and the stage manager took it back and played it. So it's the collaboration with stage managers today that help create the shows that we do. But I can't think of an example off the top of my head that there wasn't a collaborative event, with one possible exception. We were doing a chorus line in London at the Drury Lane Theatre. Theron Musser was the lighting designer. The original company of Chorus Line she suspended a platform above the ceiling at the Schubert to put the follow spots on, so she could have this proper angle for her follow spots to hit the dancers without being reflected upon the mirrors and the rest of the background. We had gone into Drury Lane, and for the first time were able to hang a loudspeaker cluster above the center of the stage to cover the multiple layers of the theater. When she came in, she said, the cluster has to go up a little bit higher because it's in the way of my follow spot shot from the platform I've hung. I said, well, it has to be there. That's where it has to be. She said, no, it has to move. I said, it's staying there, and I'm going back to my hotel room until you determine that it is going to stay there. And she said, I hope you have a very long reservation. We then saw eye to eye, and we both compromised a bit, but that was the only time. Any other questions? Wait for the microphone so I don't have to repeat the...
So I don't quite understand that the Tony Awards is not recognizing your field anymore. I mean, do you not exist?
As of this year, the Tony Committee took away the Sound Design Award in both the musical and dramatic play category, yes. For a number of reasons. The one that they basically explained was that the Tony voters are not quite aware of how to judge sound design. What is sound design in the theater? If you're wearing a dress, you come through a drawer and you can be seen, then you know scenery, costumes, and lighting. But sound is sort of a more nebulous area that they felt was not well represented. Now, I was a member of the Tony nominating committee for 3 years up until this past season. In the 3 years that I was there were only 3 or 4 times that other people on the nominating committee came to me and asked about what is sound design. So I don't think education is the total answer. The Tony Awards Committee, or the Tony Committee, is basically set up to do a television program, and they want to make sure that that's as viable as it can be to the audiences, because their existence is basically due to the income raised by the Tony presentation. So that's what the driving force is. They need to shorten it and make it more entertaining. So maybe the elimination of an award or two would help. That's just my feeling. She needs the microphone. I'll be glad to give you this one. I've stood up here long enough.
Hogged enough microphones. What do you see happening in the future with sound? You implied in your talk that perhaps sometimes sound in theatrical settings has almost become too pristine. Is that a correct interpretation?
The sound is there, like all the other creative forces, to serve the play, the musical in itself. I think our goal is to have sound that allows everybody to hear what it is at the source at the same time without calling attention to itself. And that's the desire that we need to find. I think there always will be sound. We're spoiled by it, as I've said. All of our references to what we hear or think we hear are based on pristine recordings and pristine samples of sound, not so much what we've gone out and heard with our own ears. So trying to keep it that way is, trying to keep it simple is what I think is the best way. There are directors and producers who feel differently, that we need to be more on top of it. But the simple approach, I think, is always the best. Does that somewhat answer your question?
It does. It does. Do we have any other questions? Okay. Well, then I'm sure that Abe will answer questions informally afterwards.
Absolutely.
So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Abe, I want to thank you so much on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York for your absolutely splendid presentation, the amount of thought and time that you had put into it, and to provide such a comprehensive overview of the development of sound. It was a fabulous lecture, and we are delighted to be able to host you. So thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure. Let me put this back up then.
We have a presentation we would like to make to you, and this is Victoria Dengel, our Executive Director.
And Abe, on behalf of the General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York, thank you for a wonderful, intelligent, inspiring presentation that was so thoroughly enjoyable. And it really is such an honor and a pleasure to meet the Godfather of Sound. Thank you. So that, and it says...
My diploma.
Your diploma. The General Society of Mechanics and Tradesmen of the City of New York expresses its gratitude to Abe Jacob, Broadway sound designer, for his participation in the General Society Labor, Literature, and Landmarks Lecture Series. So thank you.